It is Saturday, January 3rd, 2026. American special forces are conducting what the Pentagon calls a decapitation strike over Caracas. Smoke rises from military command centers. And Nicolás Maduro, the elected president of a sovereign nation, is being loaded onto an American warship in handcuffs. Tonight, we trace how this moment became possible. How the country with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth became the target of a 20-year campaign of coups, sanctions, sabotage, and finally, invasion. This is the story of what happens when a small nation dares to claim its own resources and the empire that could not let that stand. It always comes back to oil. By 1929, Venezuela was the world's second-largest producer. Its crude fueled the Allied victory in World War II. 80% of Britain's oil imports came from the Maracaibo Basin. The tanks that rolled into Berlin ran on Venezuelan fuel. And for decades, that wealth flowed outward, to Shell, to ExxonMobil, to the shareholders of foreign corporations, while most Venezuelans lived in poverty. Then came Hugo Chávez, who rewrote the constitution and declared that the oil belonged to the people. The empire responded with everything it had. A coup in 2002. A shadow president conjured into existence by a phone call from Mike Pence. Billions in assets frozen in foreign banks. And when none of it worked, when the government refused to fall and the people refused to rise against it, the bombs finally came. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments what you make of what's unfolding in Venezuela at this very moment. To truly understand the present, however, we have to go back to the beginning, nearly a century ago. This is the story of why the West wanted Venezuela destroyed and why they finally pulled the trigger. Chapter 1. The Curse of Black Gold. This story begins with oil. It always begins with oil. By 1929, Venezuela had become the world's second largest producer, rivaled only by the United States itself. And yet this immense wealth belonged to someone else entirely. 3 foreign companies, Shell, U.S. Standard Oil, and U.S. Gulf Oil, controlled 98% of the domestic market. The nation sat atop a fortune it could not touch. The geopolitical stakes were absolute. During the Second World War, Venezuelan crude became the lifeblood of the Allied war effort. By January 1942, Caracas was supplying 80% of Britain's oil imports, pumped safely from a continent far south of the U-boat hunting grounds. It is no exaggeration to say that Venezuelan oil fueled the Allied victory. The tanks that rolled into Berlin, the planes that darkened the skies over Dresden, they ran on fuel from the Maracaibo Basin. This arrangement stunted political development for decades. A brief flicker of democracy appeared between 1945 and 48 under Romulo Betancourt, the man they called the father of Venezuelan democracy. He dared to pursue nationalizing the oil reserves. He helped initiate membership in OPEC. The empire struck back quickly. In 1948, less than a year after Venezuela's first truly participatory election, the military executed a coup, removing Betancourt's successor and crushing the threat to foreign control. What followed was the dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez, which lasted from 1950 to 58. The New York Times described his regime as having a virulent anti-communism and his tolerant attitude toward foreign oil companies, traits that gained him the backing of the United States. President Eisenhower awarded him a Legion of Merit in 1954. This support came despite a regime where censorship, political persecution, torture, and assassination were blended with authoritarian efficiency. Pérez Jiménez fell eventually, though not because of his brutality. His sin was independence. He had grown, as observers noted, the temerity to begin developing a national industrial base rather than simply absorbing U.S. capital at high rates of interest. He broke the unspoken rule of the relationship. The post-dictatorship era was defined by the Pacto Punto Fijo of 1958, an agreement between major parties to hold elections while effectively consolidating foreign corporate interests behind a democratic mask. Parties like Acción Democrática and COPE rotated power, but never strayed from the Washington consensus. They remained beholden to global financial interests and the IMF. Beneath the surface of this democracy, a dirty war raged through the 60s and 70s against leftist guerrillas. An estimated 5,000 dead, 3,000 disappeared. Among the victims was Jorge Antonio Rodriguez, a student militant tortured to death by intelligence services in 1976. His children, Jorge and Delcy, would grow up to serve as high-level officials in the Maduro administration. They carried this history with them into the halls of power. The system began to collapse in 1989. President Carlos Andrés Pérez had been elected on an anti-austerity platform. He betrayed his voters by accepting an IMF loan and implementing what he called El Gran Viraje, the Great Turn, privatization of state utilities, abolition of price controls. Economist Juan Cristobal Nagel described it aptly as your basic Washington consensus recipe. Despair and hunger spread across the population. Sorry for the interruption. This is Charles from History After Dark, a channel that is entirely viewer-funded. I cannot produce these deep-dive documentaries without your direct support. A pledge of just a few dollars a month via Patreon or as a YouTube member provides the material base that keeps this channel alive. In return for your solidarity, you gain early access to episodes, direct voting rights on future topics, and a completely ad-free experience. Thank you. Now, back to the story. The breaking point came in February. A 30% hike in bus fares triggered the Caracazo, a week of riots and revolt. Pérez unleashed the military to crush it. Up to 3,000 people died. Mass graves were dug outside Caracas, the bodies within marked with signs of execution. Ricardo Hausmann, one of the top economic advisors who had championed these reforms, would reappear years later in a different role altogether. Historian George Chicariello Ma provides the essential context. The Bolivarian Revolution was an indirect response to neoliberalism, born of mass resistance in the streets. Into this vacuum stepped Hugo Chávez, a paratrooper from humble beginnings he had been organizing inside the military since 1982. On February 4th, 1992, he led a coup attempt. Gunfire echoed near the presidential palace. The president hid in a television station. F-16 jets were deployed against the mutineers. At least 101 people died, including 42 civilians. The coup failed. But then came the televised surrender. Chávez looked into the camera and delivered what became known as the Pora Hora speech. Comrades, regrettably for now, the objectives that we set were not achieved. New situations will arise, and the country must move decisively toward a better destiny. For now, Por Ahora, two words that became a rallying cry, a refusal to accept permanent defeat. They resonated deeply across a wounded nation. Released from prison in 1994, Chávez spent 4 years traveling the country, listening to citizens, building something. In 1998, he won a landslide election. His 1999 constitution fundamentally altered the nation, banning private monopolies and asserting that all natural resources are the property of the Republic, and therefore inalienable. The oil reserves were nationalized, the wealth would be invested in the people. Chávez had rewritten the rules of the game. He had taken the chessboard away from the oil majors and the State Department. The empire, having lost its preferred managers in Caracas, did not intend to walk away from the world's largest oil reserves. The response would come soon enough. Chapter 2. The Original Sin. The 2002 Coup. Hugo Chávez had won 2 elections in 2 years. He had rewritten the constitution with popular support, and now he was about to touch the one thing no Venezuelan leader was supposed to touch. He fired the board of directors at PDVSA, the state oil company. It was a move towards sovereignty, an assertion that Venezuelan oil should benefit Venezuelans. The reaction was immediate, and it was ferocious. On April 11, 2002, elements of the military and the business elite launched their response. Soldiers seized Chávez and flew him to a prison on an island off the coast. In Caracas, a man named Pedro Carmona stepped forward to claim the presidency. Carmona ran the Chamber of Commerce. He was a businessman, not a general. This was supposed to make things look respectable. Within hours, Carmona issued what became known as the Carmona Decree. It dissolved the National Assembly, it suspended the Supreme Court. It voided the Constitution that Venezuelans had ratified just 3 years earlier. Local officials found their powers stripped away. In the span of an afternoon, Venezuela had a dictatorship. The Western press did not describe it that way. The New York Times ran a profile of Carmona, calling him a conciliator, a mild-mannered businessman who chooses every word carefully. An editorial in the same paper celebrated the turn of events, declaring that Venezuelan democracy is no longer threatened by a would-be dictator, and that the military intervened and handed power to a respected business leader. The elected president sat in a jail cell. The man who had torn up the Constitution sat in the palace, and the paper of record called it democracy. Behind the scenes, the operation had friends in Washington. Diplomatic sources at the Organization of American States later revealed that Venezuelans plotting the coup, Carmona among them, had visited the White House to coordinate in advance, overseeing matters from George W. Bush's national security team was Elliot Abrams, a name that carried its own history. Abrams had architected the Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s. He knew how these things worked. The coup also revealed the local players who would define Venezuelan opposition politics for decades to come. Carlos Vecchio and Elias Santana had founded an organization called Ciudadanía Activa, Active Citizenry, in January of that year, just months before the tanks rolled. When Carmona issued his decree, a co-founder of the group, Rocio Guijarro, rushed to sign it as a representative of civil society. Another signatory was Maria Corina Machado, whose organization Sumate had also thrown its weight behind the new regime. These signatures would follow them for years. But the decree was never implemented. The poor descended from the hillside barrios surrounding Caracas in numbers that stunned everyone. They filled the streets demanding their president back. Pro-Chávez elements of the Presidential Guard launched a counter-operation, retaking the palace. On April 13th, a military helicopter returned Chávez to the capital. He landed to jubilant crowds. The whole thing had lasted 47 hours. A slogan was born from those days. Cada once tiene su trece. Every 11th has its 13th. It meant that coups could be reversed, that the people had a say. Washington drew its own lessons. 4 months after the failed putsch, USAID opened an Office of Transition Initiatives in Caracas. The name said everything. Transition. The mission statement was explicit about providing assistance to key political transition needs. In practice, this meant funding and training NGOs and media outlets sympathetic to American interests. Managing the money was a private firm called Development Alternatives Incorporated. The man running their Venezuela team was Antonio Iskandar, who happened to have been Carlos Vecchio's roommate at Georgetown. The funding flowed through predictable channels. Vecchio's Ciudadanía Activa received $76,900 in 2003 alone. Machado's Sumate got $53,400 from the National Endowment for Democracy. These groups turned their attention to a recall referendum in 2004, hoping to remove Chávez through legal means since the military option had failed. Chávez won the recall by 16 points with record turnout. Economist Ricardo Hausmann published a paper suggesting fraud. The Center for Economic and Policy Research examined the evidence and found nothing. The Carter Center reached the same conclusion. But the pattern had been established. When elections went the wrong way, you questioned their legitimacy. Vecchio himself had an interesting background. Before his career in civil society, he had worked as a lawyer for ExxonMobil, fighting the government's efforts to reform the oil industry. When Chávez drove ExxonMobil out of the country in 2007, Vecchio told reporters he expected to be fired, that the government would discriminate against him. The grievance was personal. He entered politics not long after, meeting Leopoldo López during a mayoral campaign and calling him a political brother. Corporate law and regime change made for compatible vocations. The clumsy coup of 2002 had backfired badly. It strengthened Chávez's hand at home and exposed the opposition as willing to shred democracy the moment they held power. Washington understood that tanks and generals were not enough, not against a population that would pour into the streets at the first sign of trouble. They needed something else. Something that looked less like the old oligarchy and more like the future. The laboratory was ready. Chapter 3. Manufacturing Dissent, the Student Lab. The coup had failed. Chávez was back in the palace, more popular than ever, and in 2006 he won re-election by a landslide. Washington needed a new approach. Tanks and generals hadn't worked. So the strategists turned to something quieter, something that looked organic. They would build an opposition from scratch, starting with the young. They called it Generation 2007. A U.S. government contractor working for USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives later admitted just how deep the involvement ran. The US had a very daring movement and brought a lot of money to the students through OTI, he said. We were the ones who showed them the first steps. He spoke of these activists with a kind of paternal pride. It's like you see your son and daughter grow up, the potential leaders when, if, there is a change of government. The training came from an unlikely source. In Belgrade, Serbia, there existed an organization called Canvas, the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies. It had been formed by veterans of Otpor, the student movement that helped topple Slobodan Milosevic with the help of nearly $3 million in US funding. A leaked email from the intelligence firm Stratfor described Canvas bluntly as an exporter revolution group, hooked into US funding and basically go around the world trying to topple dictators and autocratic governments, ones that the US does not like. In October 2005, 5 Venezuelan student activists traveled to Belgrade for a special training session. They learned the techniques of color revolutions, the symbols and slogans, the tactics of street mobilization designed to make a movement look spontaneous when it was anything but. Among these students was a young man named Juan Guaidó. Stratfor assessed the potential in 2007. Student movements are only at the beginning of what could be a years-long effort to trigger a revolution in Venezuela. Their analysts wrote, "When you see students at 5 Venezuelan universities hold simultaneous demonstrations, you will know that the training is over and the real work has begun." The testing ground came that same year. Chávez proposed a constitutional referendum, and the students launched nationwide protests against it. They also rallied against the government's decision not to renew the broadcast license of RCTV, a private television channel. The protests turned violent. Masked gunmen fired on demonstrators. In Valencia, opposition rioters killed a Chavista supporter during what they called a march of no return. The destabilization worked. Chavismo suffered its first electoral defeat, the reforms rejected by a margin of just 2%. This narrow victory transformed the student movement into the vanguard of the opposition. In 2009, 2 figures moved to formalize this energy into something more permanent. Leopoldo López and Carlos Vecchio merged Generation 2007 with a network of foreign-backed NGOs to create a new political party. They named it Voluntad Popular, the People's Will. A former OTI employee admitted to funding them directly. "We gave them money," he said. "They were pulling people away from Chávez in a subtle manner. USAID worked with party leaders to establish community groups in Chavista neighborhoods, disguising them as neutral initiatives promoting participatory democracy. Despite all this support, Voluntad Popular struggled at the ballot box. In the 2015 elections, they came in 5th. Lacking votes, they turned to chaos. In 2014, López and Maria Corina Machado launched a campaign called La Salida, meaning the exit. The goal was simple: force Maduro out of power through street pressure. Machado's directive was blunt. "We must create chaos in the streets," she said. What followed were the garimbas, violent riots featuring barricades strung with wire, vandalism of public buildings, assaults on government supporters, and Cuban doctors working in community clinics. On February the 12th, López directed his followers to the Attorney General's office, which was subsequently attacked and set ablaze. 43 people died. Hundreds more were wounded. The government did not fall. A diplomatic cable from 2004 had already revealed why Washington supported figures like Machado. Her organization received U.S. funding because it was, in the cable's words, a highly effective and well-organized opposition group. By 2005, she had secured a meeting with President Bush at the White House. Perhaps most revealing was a memo authored in 2010 by Srdja Popovic, one of the founders of Canvas. Writing for Stratfor, he identified a blackout at the Guri Dam as a potential watershed event, one that would likely have the impact of galvanizing public unrest in a way that no opposition group could ever hope to generate. His advice was to take advantage of the situation and spin it against Chavismo. The memo effectively blueprinted the weaponization of infrastructure failure nearly a decade before massive blackouts would plunge Venezuela into darkness. By the end of this period, something strange had happened. The opposition remained a minority faction, unable to win power through votes. But it had been radicalized by years of U.S. training to view chaos and infrastructure collapse as legitimate political tools. The laboratory had produced its subjects. Now they just needed the right crisis. Chapter 4. The Medieval Siege begins. The economic devastation of Venezuela did not arrive with a hurricane or an earthquake or any natural catastrophe at all. It began, rather quietly, with a diplomatic flight to the Middle East. In June of 2014, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry traveled to Saudi Arabia. His objective was to lobby the kingdom to flood the global oil market with crude. The stated purpose was to weaken Iran during nuclear negotiations, but the collateral damage to Caracas was calculated and it was catastrophic. Within 6 months, oil prices had plunged by 40%. For a nation that relied on crude for 95% of its export earnings, this was not merely an inconvenience, it was a wound to the heart. While the economy reeled, President Barack Obama signed the first round of unilateral sanctions in December of that year. The legislation carried a noble-sounding title, the Venezuela Defense of Human Rights and Civil Society Act. 3 months later came something stranger still. The Obama White House issued an executive order declaring Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. A small South American nation, somehow threatening the most powerful military on earth. The designation, however absurd, served a purpose. It legally unlocked the Treasury's ability to wage financial warfare. The impact was immediate and physical. Stratfor published satellite imagery of Puerto Cabello, Venezuela's main import hub. A photograph from February 2012 showed the port cluttered with thousands of shipping containers stacked high and dense along the docks. A second image from June 2015 revealed a harbor that was virtually empty. Between 2013 and 2019, imports to the country collapsed by 80%. Basic goods vanished from shelves. Western media blamed socialism and rarely mentioned the blockade that prevented the government from paying for food and medicine in the first place. The siege tightened further under Donald Trump. His administration had been populated by neoconservative ideologues with old scores to settle. John Bolton, the national security advisor whom President Maduro described as having a criminal mentality, proclaimed in Miami that the troika of tyranny, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela would no longer be appeased. Caracas had been placed on a regime change hit list. In August of 2017, Trump signed an executive order banning transactions involving new Venezuelan debt. The country was severed from international credit markets overnight. By March of the following year, Moody's had downgraded Venezuela's credit rating to C, its lowest possible grade. A country technically at peace now carried a lower credit score than war-torn Iraq and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ambassador Samuel Moncada explained what this pariah status meant in practice. Everything going to Venezuela, he said, has 3 or 4 times the insurance premium. Ships refused to dock. Banks refused to process payments for fear of American retribution. The United States had imposed a wartime economy on a sovereign nation without ever declaring war. Economist Francisco Rodriguez, himself a vocal critic of Maduro, published what amounted to a smoking gun. His analysis proved that the collapse in Venezuelan oil production corresponded directly with the imposition of U.S. sanctions. The data was clear. While the broader economy had been struggling, oil production remained stable until the very moment American financial penalties severed access to credit and markets. The human cost was quantified by the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Their study found that U.S. sanctions contributed to 40,000 excess deaths between 2017 and 2018 alone. Alfred de Zayas, the first UN rapporteur to visit Venezuela in 21 years, concluded after his 2017 trip that the sanctions regime was comparable with medieval sieges of towns with the intention of forcing them to surrender. He reported that 21st century sanctions attempt to bring not just a town but sovereign countries to their knees. Despite all of this, the international media apparatus effectively erased the blockade from view. Hyperinflation and scarcity were presented as the natural result of Chavismo, without context, without explanation. Former U.S. Ambassador William Brownfield admitted the strategy plainly. The goal, he said, was to accelerate the collapse, even if it produced months and perhaps years of great suffering for the Venezuelan people. Major airlines halted flights into Caracas. The cavernous Simón Bolívar International Airport grew quiet, haunted by the ghosts of decades past. Yet the expected surrender never came. The government responded with the CLAP program, a direct food distribution network that delivered boxes of staples to 6 million households every month, bypassing the private sector supply chains that had been severed by sanctions. The U.S. Treasury was so threatened by this lifeline that it sanctioned the CLAP program itself in 2019. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called it a social control mechanism, even while admitting the sanctions were designed to starve the government of resources. By 2019, the medieval siege had hollowed out the economy but failed to break the government's control. Washington realized that starvation alone was too slow. They needed a figurehead to legitimize the final phase of the takeover. They needed a face for the coup, someone who could be sold to the world as a democratic savior while serving as the legal vehicle for the greatest asset seizure in modern history. They found their man in the back rows of the opposition, a young, unknown engineer named Juan Guaidó. Chapter 5. The Shadow President. On January 23, 2019, a young lawmaker stood in a plaza in Caracas and declared himself interim president of Venezuela. His name was Juan Guaidó. He was 35 years old. And just days earlier, 81% of Venezuelans had never heard of him. The night before, Guaidó had received a phone call. It came from Washington. from Vice President Mike Pence himself, pledging full American support for what was about to unfold. By the time Guaido raised his hand and swore an oath to a constitution he had no power to enforce, the Trump administration was already drafting its recognition statement. Within hours, the United States had declared this unknown figure the legitimate head of state. It was an extraordinary thing. No government in modern history had been recognized before it actually existed. Guaido controlled no territory. He commanded no troops. He could not issue a passport or sign a trade agreement or arrest a single criminal. His authority existed entirely in press releases and the foreign bank accounts that Washington was about to hand over to him. The commercial logic was plain enough. Days after the recognition, National Security Advisor John Bolton appeared on Fox Business with a message that cut through any pretense of humanitarian concern. "It will make a big difference to the United States economically," he said, "if we could have American oil companies invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela." This was the mechanism of what some called the corporate coup. By recognizing Guaido as president, Washington created a legal fiction with very real consequences. Suddenly, Venezuelan assets held in American banks could be transferred to his shadow administration. Citgo, the crown jewel of Venezuela's foreign holdings, was now legally within reach. The recognition was less a diplomatic gesture than a skeleton key to the treasury. The administration boasted that 54 countries had joined in recognizing their man in Caracas, but the United Nations had 193 member states, and the vast majority continued to do business with Nicolás Maduro. The phrase international community, so often invoked, turned out to mean something rather narrower than it sounded. Still, Washington pressed ahead, assembling a team to run this government in exile. The shadow government was staffed by familiar faces, people who had been waiting in the wings for decades. Carlos Vecchio became the ambassador to Washington. His primary occupation now was not diplomacy in any traditional sense, but rather the seizure of Venezuelan property. He successfully petitioned the State Department to hand over the military attaché building in the capital, then removed the portraits of Simón Bolívar and replaced them with photographs of Guaido. Ricardo Hausmann took charge of economic planning. He spoke openly of a morning-after scenario that would open the nationalized oil industry to private foreign investment. He also advocated for military intervention to make it happen. The recognition allowed Washington to impose a blanket ban on Venezuelan oil exports to the American market. This was designed to choke off the government's remaining revenue, to accelerate the collapse that sanctions had already set in motion. The logic was suffocation. Make the situation so desperate that the military would abandon Maduro and throw open the palace doors. But the palace doors remained shut, and Guaido remained what he had always been, a president without a country, a commander-in-chief without a single soldier willing to follow his orders. He was a government of Narnia, as some took to calling it, a fantasy regime sustained entirely by foreign recognition and frozen bank accounts. The coup planners understood that recognition alone would not be enough. They needed something tangible, something the cameras could capture, something that would force the Venezuelan military to choose. They began preparing a spectacle on the Colombian border, a convoy of humanitarian aid that would serve as both a test and a trap. If the military let it through, they would lose face. If they blocked it, the world would see soldiers denying food to hungry civilians. Either way, the pressure would become unbearable, or so Washington believed. Chapter 6. the Trojan horse of Cucuta. The date was February 23rd, 2019, a Saturday. The plan had been building for weeks, and now everything converged on a single border crossing between Colombia and Venezuela, where a convoy of trucks sat loaded with what Washington called humanitarian aid. This was not a Red Cross mission. The supplies had arrived on U.S. Air Force cargo planes, massive C-17s that typically ferried tanks and artillery. The operation was managed by USAID. The trucks were painted white, the universal color of neutrality, but everyone understood what this was, a dare. Cross into Venezuela, force the military to either stand aside or be filmed stopping food from reaching hungry people. Either outcome served the narrative. To build momentum, the billionaire Richard Branson had organized a concert in Cucuta, the Colombian border town where the trucks waited. He called it Venezuela Aid Live, and he modeled it explicitly on Live Aid, that famous 1985 benefit. Branson appeared on stage wearing a T-shirt printed with a bleeding heart logo. He claimed 300,000 people attended to support the suffering Venezuelan population. Roger Waters, the Pink Floyd legend, refused to participate. He called it a stunt that had nothing to do with democracy and everything to do with American control of Venezuelan oil. Senator Marco Rubio flew in from Washington to serve as a kind of field marshal. He stood at the border posting threats on social media, warning Venezuelan soldiers that they would lose everything if they refused to defect. The atmosphere was strange, festive, and menacing at the same time. CNN cameras captured opposition supporters whom they described as heroes. Other footage showed those same supporters in Cucuta hotels partying through the night. One opposition member of parliament, Freddie Supolano, was poisoned with scopolamine by two women he met at the concert. His assistant died from the overdose. Then the trucks moved toward the bridge, and then they burned. The images went around the world within minutes, flames licking at the white canvas covers, smoke rising into the Colombian sky. CNN reported that Maduro's forces had set fire to aid destined for starving Venezuelans. The BBC ran similar coverage. Mike Pompeo tweeted, asking what kind of sick tyrant stops food from reaching hungry people. Vice President Pence compared Maduro to Nero watching Rome burn. But independent journalists on the ground saw something different. They watched footage of opposition supporters on the bridge, the ones called guarimberos, throwing Molotov cocktails at police lines. One of those bottles arced badly and landed on a truck. The New York Times eventually published a correction weeks later, admitting that footage contradicted the U.S. claim that Maduro had burned the convoy. The opposition had torched their own supplies. Meanwhile, the money was disappearing. Guaido had sent two envoys to Colombia, Kevin Rojas and Rosana Barrera, to manage funds for Venezuelan soldiers who defected across the border. Colombian intelligence began tracking their movements. The envoys were staying in luxury hotels. They were photographed at nightclubs in Bogota. Tens of thousands of dollars meant for housing defecting soldiers went instead to designer clothing and expensive dinners. The soldiers themselves were evicted from their lodgings and left homeless on Colombian streets. A USAID internal audit later confirmed that the entire operation had been driven by political objectives rather than humanitarian need, with fraud controls that were virtually non-existent. The Venezuelan military did not crack. The border stayed sealed. The convoy burned on the bridge, and Guaido remained stranded in Colombia, surrounded by embezzlers and a plan that had collapsed in public view. Inside Caracas, the response was defiant. While Western cameras focused on the border drama, thousands of working-class Venezuelans marched to the presidential palace. They signed an open letter rejecting American intervention. A woman at a local market told reporters to pass along a message. "Tell the news that we don't need anything," she said. "What we want is for the US to lift the blockade." The psychological operation had failed. The army had held, the people had not risen. And in Washington and Bogotá, the planners realized that if they could not trick the military into switching sides, they would have to break something else. They would have to make daily life unbearable. Within weeks, they would target the electrical grid itself, plunging the entire nation into darkness. Chapter 7. Darkness at Noon. The Cyber War. It was 5 in the afternoon on March the 7th, 2019. Across Venezuela, the lights went out. Commuter trains ground to a halt in tunnels. Traffic signals blinked once and died. Cell phones searched for signals that no longer existed. In hospitals, machines fell silent. In homes, refrigerators stopped humming. The country had been plunged into something that felt almost medieval. The failure began at the Guri Dam, deep in Estado Bolívar. This was the Simón Bolívar hydroelectric plant, a massive facility that generated somewhere between 70 and 80% of the nation's electricity. When Guri stopped, Venezuela stopped with it. Engineers in Caracas scrambled to understand what had happened. They checked systems, ran diagnostics, tried to piece together the scale of the catastrophe. But something strange was already unfolding in Washington. Hours before the blackout, Senator Marco Rubio had convened a Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee hearing. At that hearing, he had made a prediction. Venezuela, he said, was going to enter a period of suffering no nation in our hemisphere has confronted in modern history. Then came the tweet. Minutes after the grid collapsed, before Venezuelan authorities could even assess the damage, Rubio posted a hyper-specific diagnostic to social media. 18 of 23 states and the capital district, he wrote, were facing complete blackouts. He added one more detail. Backup generators at the main airport had failed. Communications Minister Jorge Rodriguez would later point to this timeline with obvious suspicion. At the moment Rubio hit send, the Venezuelan government itself did not yet know that those generators had failed. Rodriguez branded Rubio and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo as psychopaths, suggesting they possessed intimate knowledge of a sabotage operation. Was a cyber attack plausible? Tech analyst Kalev Litaru argued in Forbes that such an operation was quite realistic. Remote cyber operations, he noted, rarely require a significant ground presence. And the United States likely maintained a deep presence within the country's national infrastructure grid. The capability existed. The New York Times had recently reported on the Trump administration's aggressive use of what it called cyber tools, revealing that the US had escalated digital incursions into Russia's power grid. If Washington was willing to probe Russian infrastructure, Venezuela seemed a far easier target. The blackout followed the exact blueprint laid out in that canvas memo from 2010. The prophecy of a watershed event had been fulfilled. Guaido followed this script with precision. Minutes after the country went dark, he tweeted, "Light comes with the end of usurpation. Basic services, in other words, were now conditional on regime change." Pompeo joined what can only be described as a macabre victory lap. "No food," he tweeted. "No medicine. Now, no power. Next, no Maduro. He was effectively cheering for the humanitarian crisis he claimed to be solving. The blackout was designed to be a breaking point. UN Rapporteur Alfred de Zayas had identified this strategy as a medieval siege, an attempt to force them to surrender by making daily life unlivable. The expectation was social explosion, mass protests, perhaps even spontaneous military defection. It never came. Venezuelans adapted with communal resilience, sharing generators, organizing water distribution, helping elderly neighbors navigate the darkness. The state worked methodically to restore the grid. By April, the lights flickered back on. Maduro remained in the presidential palace at Miraflores. The opposition was left holding nothing but failed prophecies. Washington had flipped the switch, expecting the darkness to cloak a revolution, but the people had refused to break. Chapter 8. The April 30 Putsch. The Blue Armbands. The phone rang at 5:25 in the morning. John Bolton was on the line with Mike Pompeo, and both men believed they were witnessing the final act. The coup was happening. 20 minutes later, Bolton did something he had never done before in his tenure as National Security Advisor. He woke the president. Trump's response, according to those present, was a single word. "Wow," said flatly, without enthusiasm. The man who had been promised a quick victory was already growing skeptical of his team's promises. Across the Caribbean, the sun was just beginning to warm the pavement of the Francisco Fajardo Highway in Caracas. Juan Guaidó stood near the La Carlota Air Base, filming a live stream on his phone, flanked by a small cluster of soldiers. They wore blue armbands to signal their defection. The visual was meant to project strength, the beginning of a wave. Instead, it revealed something closer to desperation. Fewer than a dozen men stood with him. The massive airbase behind them remained firmly, unmistakably, under government control. Guaidó waved his hands as he spoke, calling for a mass uprising, for the people to flood the streets, for the military to abandon Maduro. Observers would later describe his gestures as gawkish. Standing just over his shoulder was Leopoldo López, the radical opposition leader who had broken out of house arrest that very morning to join the operation. His presence was meant to signal that the real power had arrived to claim victory. The entire plan rested on one assumption. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino López had been turned. The CIA believed he would deliver the military to the opposition. Bolton would later admit in his memoir that Padrino López had tricked them, offering what seemed like passive support during back-channel negotiations, only to remain loyal to Maduro when dawn broke and the operation actually launched. The sun rose higher over El Avila mountain. The expected wave of defections never came. No generals appeared on television to announce their allegiance to Guaidó. No tanks rolled toward the presidential palace. The coup leaders found themselves exposed on a highway overpass, commanders without an army, revolutionaries without a revolution. In Washington, the propaganda machine lurched into action. Pompeo went on CNN and claimed that Maduro had an aeroplane on the tarmac ready to flee to Cuba that very morning, but that the Russians had told him to stay. Bolton took to Twitter, issuing what read like threats from a gangster film. He warned Padrino López that this was his last chance to accept amnesty, otherwise he would go down with the ship. The American media played its part with enthusiasm. Jake Tapper of CNN tweeted a photograph of soldiers in blue armbands firing their weapons, accompanied by the caption claiming the Maduro government was mowing down citizens. The image actually showed the mutineers themselves. Tapper deleted the tweet after widespread ridicule, but the incident revealed how readily the press would launder whatever narrative Washington provided. By mid-afternoon, the whole thing had collapsed. Reuters reported an uneasy peace settling over Caracas, with no indication the opposition could take power. Leopoldo López fled first to the Chilean diplomatic residence, then to the Spanish embassy. Guaidó was photographed standing alone on the highway, a cell phone pressed to his ear, his expression stunned. He was presumably receiving instructions from handlers who were themselves scrambling to understand what had gone wrong. The failure shattered whatever confidence Trump had left in his war room. Leaks soon emerged that the president felt misled. He began mocking Guaidó privately as the Beto O'Rourke of Venezuela, a lightweight, a loser. His assessment of Maduro shifted too. The man he had been assured was weak, isolated, ready to crumble, Trump now described as a tough cookie. That evening on Fox News, Tucker Carlson asked the question that hung over the entire debacle. When was the last time we successfully meddled in the political life of another country? Has it ever worked? A retired colonel named Douglas McGregor joined him to warn that American history in Latin America was a disaster, and that Guaidó would be forever tainted as a puppet of Washington. The day ended with the opposition fractured and the White House looking foolish. They had played their strongest card, a military mutiny. And they had been bluffed by a defense minister who smiled through the negotiations and then stood firm when it mattered. The result was something between tragedy and farce, mostly farce. With no options left in Caracas, the coup plotters turned their attention elsewhere. If they could not take the presidential palace, perhaps they could seize something smaller, something that could not shoot back. Their eyes settled on the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, a diplomatic compound in Georgetown that would soon become the site of a very different kind of siege. Chapter 9. The Embassy Siege. The day after the failed uprising in Caracas, a quieter battle began on a leafy street in Georgetown. Carlos Vecchio, the man Washington recognized as Venezuela's ambassador, arrived at the embassy with every intention of taking it. The building stood there, as it always had, a handsome brick structure shaded by old trees. But inside, a small group of American activists had set up camp, sleeping bags spread across the marble floors, determined to prevent what they saw as an illegal seizure of sovereign territory. Vecchio controlled nothing within the embassy's walls. The activists inside had been invited by the actual Venezuelan government, the one with embassies and ministries and a functioning state. They'd arrived weeks earlier, after Medea Benjamin posted a photograph of herself in a blue sleeping bag on the embassy floor, alerting the world to what was being planned. The State Department had hoped for a quiet handover. That hope evaporated. What followed was a siege unlike anything the neighborhood had witnessed. Vecchio summoned supporters from the suburbs of Washington and from South Florida, Venezuelan expats who set up tents on the pavement and turned the quiet residential street into something resembling a carnival designed by sadists. They blasted reggaeton at all hours. Air horns sounded through the night. The activists inside, people like Kevin Zeese and Dr. Margaret Flowers, veterans of decades of anti-war organizing, found themselves unable to sleep for days at a stretch. Windows were smashed. A garage door was removed entirely. When supporters on the outside tried to pass food through the gaps, they were physically assaulted while Secret Service agents looked on. The electricity went next. Someone had convinced Pepco, the local utility, to cut the power. Then the water stopped flowing, the line mysteriously severed. Inside a diplomatic facility protected under international law, American citizens rationed peanut butter and bread, reading books from the embassy library by the light that filtered through broken windows. They studied the history of Latin American interventions while living through one. On April 26th, Vecchio sent a letter to the State Department doing something remarkable. He formally waived the embassy's diplomatic inviolability and invited American police to raid the building. An ambassador, or at least a man claiming to be one, was asking a foreign power to violate the sovereignty of the nation he claimed to represent. The contradictions piled up like debris. The raid came on May 15th. Federal agents arrived in flak vests and night vision goggles, carrying a battering ram. They smashed through the doors as though storming a compound, arresting the 4 remaining activists. Zeiss, Flowers, David Paul, and Adrian Pine were charged with interfering with the protective functions of the State Department. They faced up to a year in prison for the crime of sleeping in a building with permission from its legal owners. The trial that followed had a quality of absurdity that might have been comic if the stakes weren't real. Judge Beryl A. Howell, an Obama appointee, ruled that the defense could make no mention of international law. They couldn't discuss the political situation in Venezuela. They couldn't explain why they were there in the first place. The jury deadlocked. Eventually, the activists accepted a plea deal. Adrian Pine said she proudly pleaded guilty to obstructing imperialism and neoliberal fascism. Vecchio got his building. He stood in the doorway of an embassy that had been handed to him by American federal agents in a city where he held no actual power, representing a government that controlled no territory and commanded no army. The victory, such as it was, proved only that his authority derived entirely from Washington. He was an ambassador without a country, a diplomat whose credentials existed only in the filing cabinets of the State Department. Kevin Zeiss died unexpectedly in September of 2020, collapsing at his home after years of tireless organizing. The tiger lilies from his garden continued to bloom the following spring, as they do every year. The embassy stands quiet now, its halls empty of sleeping bags and rationed bread, but the precedent had been set. International law could be waived with a letter, sovereignty could be dissolved with a signature, and the shadow government, having secured the symbols of diplomacy, turned its attention to something more valuable than real estate. The lawyers had been preparing for years. The real prize was waiting offshore. Chapter 10. The Great Citgo Robbery. The story begins in the jungles of southeastern Venezuela, where the earth holds one of the largest undeveloped gold deposits on the planet, a place called Las Cristinas. In 2008, during the global financial crisis, the Venezuelan government expropriated the mine from a Canadian company called Crystalex. The decision triggered a legal battle that would stretch across a decade and eventually reach all the way to the glass towers of Delaware, where lawyers in expensive suits would argue over the fate of a gas station empire worth nearly $8 billion. Citgo, you've probably passed one of their stations on an American highway, filled up your tank without a second thought. But Citgo was Venezuela's crown jewel abroad, the most valuable asset the country held outside its own borders, and it became the target. In 2016, a World Bank tribunal ordered Venezuela to pay Cristalex $1.2 billion in compensation for the seized gold mine. The problem was collection. Venezuela refused to pay, and the company had no way to force the issue. They needed a mechanism, a legal crowbar, to pry open the vault. They found one in an obscure concept called alter ego. The argument went like this. If you could prove that Citgo was merely an instrument of the Venezuelan state, a puppet with no independent will of its own, then you could seize its assets to pay government debts. The corporate veil would dissolve, the gas stations, the refineries, the billions in infrastructure would all become fair game. But proving alter ego required expert testimony, someone who understood the inner workings of Venezuelan state companies, someone willing to argue that the government treated its oil giant as a political tool rather than an independent corporation. Enter José Ignacio Hernández, a Venezuelan law professor with impeccable credentials and a complicated relationship with the truth. In 2017, Hernández served as an expert witness for Cristalex, providing testimony that supported precisely the legal theory the Canadian company needed. He argued in court that the Venezuelan government used PDVSA, the state oil company that owned Citgo, as a political instrument. His words helped build the case that would eventually crack open the asset. Then came the twist. When Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president in January 2019, he needed to assemble a shadow cabinet of sorts, people to manage the legal and financial apparatus of a government that existed primarily in the recognition of foreign powers. For the crucial position of Special Attorney General, the man tasked with defending Venezuela's foreign assets from seizure, Guaidó chose Hernández. The same man who had previously helped Cristalex attack those very assets now stood as their supposed defender. The opposition-controlled National Assembly moved quickly. They directly appointed new boards for PDVSA and its American subsidiaries, inserting government hands straight into the corporate structure. Crystalex's lawyers watched with something approaching glee. In court filings, they cited these appointments as evidence of alter ego, noting what they called a complete disregard for corporate formalities. The shadow government had handed them the ammunition they needed. In July 2019, a Delaware court ruled that Cristalex could seize $1.2 billion of Citgo's assets. A Venezuelan engineer named Jorge Alejandro Rodriguez had tried to warn opposition lawmakers that Hernández's conduct was sabotaging their defense. He was ignored. When the scandal broke, Hernández produced a recusal letter claiming he had stepped back from the case months earlier. But metadata analysis of the document suggested something uncomfortable. The letter appeared to have been created in July, the same day the controversy erupted, casting doubt on the timeline. The letter was addressed to Carlos Vecchio. Vecchio and Ricardo Hausmann publicly defended Hernández as honest and capable. The precedent had been set. Other corporations began lining up. Owens, Illinois, a glass manufacturer with its own claims against Venezuela, had also paid Hernández over $163,000 for expert testimony in previous litigation. Koch Industries joined the queue. The Attorney General, meant to protect the nation's wealth, had spent years helping corporations build cases against it. In June 2020, a leaked audio recording surfaced. On it, Hernández could be heard boasting about personally overseeing a strategy directly with the World Bank president to manage Venezuela's legal battles. He resigned shortly after, but the damage was irreversible. A U.S. court in 2023 cited Guaido's own actions as justification for allowing creditors to seize Citgo, proving that the shadow government had become the architect of its own assets' destruction. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez appeared on Venezuelan television, holding photographs of Hernandez and Vecchio. Across the images, a single word had been printed in bold letters: ladrón, thief. The looting of Citgo played out in courtrooms and conference calls, a white-collar heist conducted through depositions and legal briefs. But across the Atlantic, in the vaults beneath the Bank of England, a far simpler form of seizure was underway. No alter ego arguments required, just a locked door and a foreign government's decision about who counted as president. Chapter 11. The Gold Wars. In the vaults beneath the Bank of England sat 31 tons of Venezuelan gold, nearly $2 billion worth of gleaming bars, stacked in the darkness of one of the world's most secure buildings. The Venezuelan government had been requesting its return since November of 2018, months before anyone had heard the name Juan Guaidó. The Bank of England refused. This was no bureaucratic delay, no paperwork backlog in some dusty administrative office. John Bolton would later admit in his memoir that the British Foreign Minister, Jeremy Hunt, had been delighted to cooperate with Washington's regime change efforts. The method was simple: freeze the gold. On January 27, 2019, Guaidó sent a letter to Prime Minister Theresa May. He asked her not to return the gold to Caracas, claiming it would be used to repress the Venezuelan people. Days later, the UK officially recognized him as president, and with that recognition came a legal puzzle that would tie the courts in knots for years. Which president controlled the gold? The one who actually governed the country, or the one who had declared himself leader on a street corner after a phone call from Mike Pence? While the lawyers deliberated, the bars stayed where they were, frozen, untouchable, a nation's savings locked away in a foreign vault. The operation extended across the Atlantic. Citigroup held $1.3 billion of Venezuelan gold as collateral for a loan. When that loan arrangement ended, the bank sold the gold and deposited the $258 million surplus into a frozen account now controlled by Guaidó's faction. The U.S. Treasury then transferred these funds to the New York Federal Reserve. The Venezuelan government called it vulgar plunder. The phrase was accurate. Guaidó's team claimed they were protecting the money for Venezuela's future. Reports soon emerged that they were using the seized funds to pay their own legal fees. In 2021, British journalist John McAvoy uncovered documents showing they had spent £400,000 of looted Venezuelan money fighting the Bank of England case. They were paying lawyers with the victim's own wallet. The U.S. Treasury authorized opposition lawmakers to pay themselves $5,000 a month from frozen assets. Millions more went toward luxury hotels and travel expenses for coup operatives living abroad. The humanitarian justification for the asset seizure grew harder to maintain with each expense report. President Maduro called it 21st century piracy. The phrase carried historical weight. Britain had once issued letters of marque to privateers, licensing them to plunder Spanish galleons in the Caribbean. The gold vaults of the Bank of England had been filled, in part, by that earlier age of imperial extraction. Now the mechanism had evolved. The privateers wore suits, and the plunder moved through swift transfers rather than cannon fire, but the underlying logic remained. The gold freeze had consequences beyond symbolism. Venezuela needed those reserves to import food and medicine. The country was already reeling from sanctions, and now a pandemic was spreading across the globe. The resources that might have purchased ventilators or insulin sat uselessly in London, guarded by armed men in a building the Venezuelan government could not enter. In 2020, journalists exposed a secret Foreign Office unit called the Venezuela Reconstruction Unit. The name told the story. London was already planning how British companies might profit from Venezuela's economy after Maduro fell. Foreign Minister Jorge Arriaza confronted the British chargé d'affaires directly. He asked whether they intended to bomb and attack Venezuela, then reconstruct it with their companies and extract profit from Venezuelan tragedy. The diplomat did not have a satisfying answer. The Gold Wars sent a message that echoed far beyond Caracas. Central banks in Africa, Asia, and Latin America watched closely. The lesson was unmistakable. Your reserves are safe in Western financial institutions only as long as your foreign policy aligns with Western interests. Step out of line, and the vaults lock. The accounts freeze. Your national wealth becomes a bargaining chip in someone else's geopolitical game. The theft of gold and the seizure of Citgo were clean operations. They happened in courtrooms and boardrooms, mediated by lawyers and bankers in air-conditioned offices. Signatures on documents, gavels striking wood, funds transferred with keystrokes. But the regime change industry also attracted a different element altogether: mercenaries, adventurers. Men who believed that a handful of rifles and a speedboat could accomplish what sanctions and lawfare had failed to achieve. As the legal battles dragged on through 2019 and into 2020, a former Green Beret named Jordan Goudreau was finalizing arrangements with the shadow government. He had a contract. He had a plan. The boardroom coup was about to wash up on a Venezuelan beach. Chapter 12, Operation Gideon, the Silver Screen Invasion. On the 1st of May, 2020, the Associated Press broke a story that seemed lifted from the pages of a bad thriller. A plot called Operation Gideon. The plan was to infiltrate Venezuela with a small force of combatants, capture President Maduro, and fly him out of the country. At the center of this conspiracy stood a man named Jordan Goudreau, a former Green Beret with a flair for publicity and a private security company called Silvercorp USA. He had previously tried to sell American schools a subscription service that would place undercover agents in hallways to stop shooters. Now he had his sights set on toppling a government. Goudreau had secured a contract with the Venezuelan opposition. The document bore the signatures of Juan Guaidó and his political strategist, J.J. Rendon. It promised Silvercorp over $200 million, secured against future oil revenues, in exchange for removing Maduro from power. The deal existed, on paper at least. The resources to carry it out did not. In Colombia, training camps had been established for Venezuelan military deserters who had pledged themselves to the cause. The conditions were grim. The men lived in squalor, practicing maneuvers with sawed-off broomsticks because they had no rifles. Goudreau insisted he had connections in Washington, high-level contacts in the Trump administration. He pointed to his past work providing security at Trump rallies as evidence of his access. Whether anyone in power took him seriously remains an open question. The operation launched on the 3rd of May. A small group of fighters attempted a maritime invasion, approaching the Venezuelan coast in speedboats. They were intercepted almost immediately. Venezuelan security forces had thoroughly infiltrated the plot from the beginning. They knew it was coming. While his men were being captured on the beaches of Chihuahua, Goudreau filmed himself in Florida wearing a Yankees cap, announcing the attack as if it were succeeding. He claimed that units had been activated deep inside Caracas. The reality was already unraveling. 8 of the mercenaries were killed. Dozens more were captured, including 2 American citizens, Luke Denman and Aaron Berry, both former Special Forces teammates of Goudreau. They would later appear on Venezuelan television, confessing to a plan to secure the airport so Maduro could be extracted to the United States. The aftermath brought a cascade of blame. Guaido denied ever signing the contract, but Goudreau leaked an audio recording in which the interim president seemed to endorse the deal. Rendon admitted paying $50,000 for what he called strategic planning, though he claimed he had cut ties when Goudreau grew erratic and demanded more money. The involvement of the American government hovered over everything like smoke. Goudreau insisted he had met with officials at the White House and in the Vice President's office. A retired Venezuelan general named Cleaver Alcalá, who had been involved in the planning, surrendered himself to the DEA in Colombia just days before the raid. Around the same time that Washington placed a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head. The timing raised questions that were never quite answered. Secretary of State Pompeo denied any direct involvement. He joked that if the United States had been involved, things would have gone differently. The quip ignored the fact that 2 Americans now sat in Venezuelan custody. Defense Secretary Mark Esper would later write about a meeting in which opposition officials hinted at some plans taking shape in Florida, suggesting the National Security Council knew something was brewing. James Story, the American diplomat stationed in Bogota, was known to be close to the opposition and surely aware of the training camps across the border. He did nothing to stop what would have been a violation of American neutrality laws. The raid exposed something rotten at the heart of the opposition project. These were people willing to hire foreign mercenaries to attempt an armed invasion of their own country while living in Miami penthouses and partying through the planning stages. It was reckless. It was delusional. Some called it the Bay of Piglets, a humiliating echo of an earlier American disaster in the Caribbean. The failure strengthened Maduro's hand considerably. It proved the loyalty of his military. It showcased the depth of the opposition's incompetence. And it buried, at least for the moment, any fantasy that a small band of commandos could overthrow the Bolivarian revolution. The beaches of Chihuahua became a kind of graveyard for that particular dream. The mercenaries had failed in the surf, but the war was far from over. It simply shifted terrain, moving from the coastline to the conference rooms of international diplomacy, where the United States would attempt to use the institutions of global governance to erase the Venezuelan government from legitimacy altogether. Chapter 13. Diplomatic Trench Warfare. The battle had moved indoors, to the plush carpets and polished wood of the United Nations headquarters in New York. Here, in April of 2019, Vice President Mike Pence strode into the Security Council chamber with one goal in mind. He wanted the assembled diplomats to recognize Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. He wanted them to treat Nicolás Maduro as though he had already ceased to exist. Pence broke with diplomatic protocol almost immediately. He turned to face the Venezuelan ambassador directly, a man named Samuel Moncada, and addressed him as though lecturing a wayward student. "With all due respect, Mr. Ambassador, you shouldn't be here," Pence said. "You should return to Venezuela and tell Nicolás Maduro that his time is up. It's time for him to go." Moncada, who had spent years studying history before entering politics, watched the performance with something close to detachment. He had seen this kind of theater before, in textbooks and archival footage from earlier decades of American intervention. That's not diplomacy, that's bullying. He would later reflect. Might is right is not the kind of thinking that succeeds here. While Pence made speeches, Venezuela's foreign minister Jorge Arreaza was working the corridors. He announced the formation of something called the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations, a coalition of countries who opposed the principle of unilateral intervention, who believed that one powerful nation should not be permitted to simply declare the government of another illegitimate. The coalition grew quietly, drawing members from across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Washington responded to Arreaza personally. The Treasury Department placed sanctions on a sitting foreign minister, which was unprecedented, and restricted his movements to a radius of 25 miles around the UN headquarters in Manhattan. He could attend meetings. He could not leave the city. Arreaza seemed almost amused by the pettiness of it. "They are like thugs, no?" he said of the Trump administration officials, "in a barrio." Meanwhile, a parallel operation was unfolding at the Organization of American States in Washington. The American ambassador there, Carlos Trujillo, needed to seat Guaido's representative, a man named Gustavo Tarre. The problem was that the General Assembly required a 2/3 majority for such matters, and Trujillo did not have the votes. So he forced the question through the Permanent Council instead, where a simple majority would suffice. It was a procedural trick, the kind of maneuver that works once and poisons the well forever. Ronald Sanders, the ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda, warned that this would damage the institutional framework of the OAS irreparably. When someone asked Trujillo to cite the specific article in the charter that permitted his actions, he stumbled. Article, yeah, in the charter. He managed, unable to name the rule he was breaking. The man they installed, Gustavo Tarre, had been circulating through Washington think tanks for years. He had attended a meeting at the Center for Strategic and International Studies with a title that suggested something more than diplomacy, assessing the use of military force in Venezuela. Tarre himself advocated publicly for a no-fly zone and military intervention similar to what had happened in Syria. In Syria, there has been the use of force to give food and medicine to people, he explained, and I am personally open to this kind of solution. By September of 2019, the diplomatic war reached the General Assembly itself. The United States lobbied furiously to prevent the Venezuelan delegation from speaking. They failed. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez took the podium and held up a photograph for the cameras. It showed Juan Guaidó posing with members of a Colombian drug cartel called Los Rastrojos. She called him an imperial puppet. American diplomats staged a walkout while she spoke, filing out of the chamber in a gesture that registered more as impotence than protest. "They are wandering like ghosts at the United Nations," Arreaza observed. The effort to isolate Venezuela had collapsed. The international community that Washington kept invoking turned out to be a minority of nations, mostly American allies and satellites. The vast majority of the UN's 193 member states refused to endorse the coup. Africa stood particularly firm. Despite enormous pressure, the continent remained unified in rejecting the precedent of letting Washington install leaders of its choosing. Yuri Pimentel, the Vice Minister for African Affairs, noted that the pressure had been immense, but the line held. The diplomatic trenches had held. The United States had broken rules, burned through political capital, bullied and threatened and maneuvered, and in the end, the world had declined to play along. But survival required more than speeches and coalition building. Venezuela still needed food and fuel and access to financial systems. With the dollar weaponized and Western markets closed, the government in Caracas would have to look elsewhere. It would have to turn east. Chapter 14. The Multipolar Lifeline. In July of 2019, something unexpected happened in Caracas. The city had been under siege for months, its people squeezed by sanctions, its government isolated by Washington, and yet into this besieged capital came diplomats from across the globe. The non-aligned movement was convening, and suddenly Venezuela found itself at the center of a gathering storm. Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif arrived to crowds cheering in the streets. He had a message for his colleagues, delivered with the kind of dry precision that cuts through diplomatic niceties. "Stop calling them sanctions," he suggested. "Just Google the word terrorism. The unlawful use of violence or intimidation, especially against civilians in pursuit of political gains. That," he argued, was what the United States was doing with its financial warfare. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov stood before the Assembly and spoke of something that would have seemed unthinkable even a decade earlier: the end of dollar dominance. "We will use ways that will diminish the role of the dollar and the US banking system," he announced. Russia was building alternative financial networks, a system called SPFS, the architecture of a different world. These were words, yes, but they were also blueprints. Venezuela, Russia, Iran, and China began constructing what some called a resistance economy, a way to move goods and money that bypassed Washington entirely. The medieval siege, it turned out, had a weakness. The castle had a back door, and it opened to the east. The most dramatic moment came in 2020. Venezuela's refineries had been crippled by sanctions, and the country faced a devastating fuel shortage. Cars sat idle, supply chains ground to a halt. Tehran's response was to send 5 gasoline tankers across the Atlantic Ocean. The United States deployed Navy destroyers to the Caribbean. Surveillance aircraft circled overhead. Maximum pressure, they called it. A blockade in all but name. The tankers kept coming. In May, escorted by Venezuelan fighter jets, the Iranian flotilla docked at Puerto Cabello. Oil Minister Tariq El-Aissami stood on the pier to welcome them. "We are not anyone's colony," he declared. "Thank you for your solidarity and courage." The ships had crossed an ocean under the shadow of American warships, and they had arrived anyway. Iran sent more than gasoline. Technicians came to repair the battered refineries. A supermarket called Megasis opened in Caracas, its shelves stocked with Iranian goods. 2 economies, separated by thousands of miles, began weaving themselves together. Behind many of these deals stood a Colombian businessman named Alex Saab. He had been appointed as a Venezuelan diplomat, tasked with procuring food and fuel when traditional channels had been slammed shut. Gold for gas swaps with Iran, food imports through Turkey. Saab became the linchpin of the resistance economy, the man who kept the country fed and moving. In June of 2020, Saab was traveling to Tehran on a diplomatic mission. His plane stopped to refuel in Cape Verde, a small island nation off the African coast. He never completed the journey. American agents orchestrated his arrest, despite his diplomatic status. What followed was grim. Saab later wrote that he was kept in a cell with only an hour of daylight a day. He described physical abuse, pressure to confess. The USS San Jacinto, an American warship, appeared off Cape Verde's shores, a reminder of what happened to small nations that defied Washington's wishes. Saab was eventually extradited to Miami in October of 2021. But by then, something had shifted. The supply lines he had helped build were running on their own. Russia and China had stepped in to help Venezuela bypass SWIFT and conduct trade outside the dollar system. India continued purchasing Venezuelan oil despite American pressure. Turkey became a hub for gold processing and food imports. The alliance of the sanctioned had proven something important. The United States could no longer isolate a country by decree. It could threaten and seize and blockade, but it could not close every door. The world had grown too interconnected, too multipolar, too tired of taking orders from one capital. The siege had failed. The patient had survived. Fed and fueled by partners that Washington could not reach without risking wider conflict, Venezuela had stabilized. The economic warfare had not produced collapse. The coups had not produced mutiny. And inside the country, the interim government of Juan Guaidó was beginning to rot from within, its legitimacy evaporating with every sunrise that found Nicolás Maduro still in the presidential palace. The final act of this long drama would not arrive with thunder. It would come quietly as the opposition fractured and the West began to look away from its failed experiment. Chapter 15. The End of Empire. By January 2020, the presidency of Juan Guaidó had become something closer to farce. He arrived at the National Assembly building that month to find security guards at the entrance. They told him the rest of his colleagues could enter. He refused. Unless certain disqualified lawmakers were allowed to accompany him, he would not go in. And so began one of the stranger scenes in modern political theater. Guaidó, wearing a suit, attempted to climb the spiked iron fence surrounding the building. He made it partway up before losing his grip and tumbling back down. Cameras captured the whole thing. Meanwhile, the opposition coalition he claimed to lead was splitting apart. Moderate factions had grown tired of the American-mandated strategy of boycotting elections entirely. They wanted to participate in the December 2020 legislative vote. They did. Over 300 international observers watched as Venezuelans went to the polls, and when the ballots were counted, the ruling party had cemented its control of the National Assembly. Guaidó's term as Assembly President was now legally over. The title that had supposedly made him interim president of the entire country had simply expired. Leopoldo López, operating from exile in Spain, tried to undermine the election with a video he posted online. It showed a government official named Diosdado Cabello saying something that López claimed meant those who don't vote don't eat. The phrase was actually a pun, a Venezuelan play on the word coma, which can mean both to eat and something far more colloquial. American media ran with the mistranslation anyway. Venezuelan voters seemed unbothered. Some pointed out that their own voting system, with its biometric verification and paper trail, had produced a clear result within hours. The American election that same year had taken days to resolve. One voter put it plainly: there is no bigger fraud than the one committed in the US. The final moment came 2 years later. On December 30th, 2022, the Venezuelan opposition held a vote of their own. They dissolved the interim government entirely. Guaido pleaded with his former allies. To annul this government, he said, is to leap into the void. They ignored him. The imaginary presidency was replaced by a committee whose main purpose was managing the foreign assets that had been seized during the years of the shadow government. Citgo, the gold held in London, the money in frozen accounts. The plunder would continue. It simply wouldn't have a face anymore. Something else shifted that year. The war in Ukraine sent oil prices surging, and suddenly the Biden administration found itself in an awkward position. They needed oil. Venezuelan oil. A delegation was sent to Caracas to meet with Nicolás Maduro, the very man Washington officially claimed was not the president. The meeting happened anyway. The rhetoric about democracy and human rights grew quieter when gas prices climbed. At the Summit of the Americas in June 2022, the cracks showed publicly. The United States had excluded Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua from the gathering. In response, Mexico's president boycotted the event entirely. Other regional leaders followed. Biden's party was spoiled. When a reporter asked Nancy Pelosi about Guaido's absence from the summit, she paused. By whom? She asked, apparently having forgotten the name of the man she had once given a standing ovation. The puppet had slipped from memory. The coup did not end with a dramatic collapse. There was no singular moment of defeat. It simply faded, like a radio signal weakening as you drive further from the tower. The interim government dissolved. The opposition committee took over the seized assets. The Venezuelan state, battered and blockaded, remained standing. Maduro still occupied the presidential palace. The military had never flipped. The people who had poured into the streets in 2019 to demand change had gone home or had never been as numerous as the cameras made them appear. What remained was a treasury that had been picked clean from abroad, a divided opposition that had turned on itself, and a lesson, perhaps, about the limits of economic warfare and manufactured legitimacy. The sanctions had caused suffering. The cyber attacks had caused blackouts. The mercenary invasion had caused embarrassment, but none of it had produced the outcome Washington wanted. The world had watched, and much of it had refused to play along. The unipolar moment, if it had ever truly existed, was over. Venezuela had outlasted it. Epilogue: The Return of the Monroe Doctrine. It happened on Saturday, January 3rd, 2026. The military option that Donald Trump and John Bolton had threatened for years has finally materialized over the skies of Caracas. U.S. Special Forces launched what officials are calling a decapitation strike. Airstrikes hit military command centers across the capital, and as smoke rises over La Carlota Air Base, President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady Kilia Flores are in American custody. The images are spreading across the world as we speak. Maduro in handcuffs, escorted by DEA agents onto the deck of the USS Iwo Jima. It calls to mind another operation, another era. In 1989, American forces invaded Panama and dragged Manuel Noriega from his refuge to face drug charges in a U.S. court. The legal justification for that invasion had been drafted by a young Justice Department lawyer named William Barr. Now, more than 3 decades later, the same playbook has been dusted off and deployed against Venezuela. The Panama precedent has found its second act. Trump has announced that the detainees will face the full wrath of American justice in the Southern District of New York. This is the culmination of the lawfare strategy launched in March 2020, when the State Department placed a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head. The charge is narco-terrorism. The bounty was an invitation, and the extraction fulfills both. What comes next is surprising even some within the opposition. Rather than handing power to Maria Corina Machado or what remains of the Guaido faction, Trump has declared that the United States will run Venezuela directly. The phrase hangs in the air. Run. The mask of democratic transition has been stripped away entirely. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who spent years in the Senate lobbying for exactly this outcome, is positioned as the de facto administrator of the occupation, a viceroy for the 21st century. Machado and the opposition leaders who spent years positioning themselves as America's partners are discovering the truth of their situation. They have been assets, useful for press conferences and congressional hearings, but ultimately disposable. Trump has extended an invitation to major American energy firms, ExxonMobil, Chevron, others. He speaks of revitalizing the Venezuelan oil industry, of unlocking the potential of the world's largest proven reserves. This is the corporate coup made physical. The plans that Ricardo Hausmann and his Harvard colleagues drafted for the morning after are finally being implemented. The nationalized industry that Hugo Chávez built is being parceled out to the very companies his revolution expelled. In Caracas, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has assumed the presidency from what remains of the government's emergency bunkers. She is calling the abduction an atrocity. Her defiance echoes something from the past. The way the poor poured into the streets in 2002 to demand Chávez return. Whether that same popular resistance can materialize against American air power remains to be seen. The collectivos have long warned of asymmetric warfare if an invasion ever came. The invasion has come. Pedestrians are running through the streets as smoke rises over the city. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has expressed alarm at what he calls Wild West diplomacy. The international order, such as it was, has been openly discarded. The United States has asserted its right to kidnap a sitting head of state, to govern a sovereign nation by military force. The Monroe Doctrine, dormant for decades, has returned. In Doral, Florida, crowds of Venezuelan exiles are celebrating in the streets. In Mexico City and Washington, protesters are gathering to denounce the invasion. The contrast reveals something essential about the operation. This is a policy designed for domestic American consumption, for Florida's electoral map, for the political fortunes of those who staked their careers on regime change. American officials are preparing for what they call a second and much larger operation to quell the resistance already forming in the barrios. The siege that began with Obama's declaration of an extraordinary threat in 2015, that intensified with Trump's sanctions and the Guaido recognition, that continued through blackouts and border provocations and a botched mercenary invasion, has reached its final stage. The sanctions were siege engines, softening the walls. The military has simply walked through. This is where the story ends, or perhaps where a different story begins. The invasion is the inevitable conclusion of a policy that views Venezuela as a company to be acquired rather than a country to be respected. The West wants Venezuela's oil. Venezuela has insisted that oil belongs to its people. And now, with American troops in the capital and the pumps preparing to restart for foreign shareholders, the question is no longer who governs Venezuela. The question is whether the age of sovereignty means anything at all.